Support for WABE comes from Capital Good Fund, introducing Georgia Bright Solar Lease Program, a new rooftop solar initiative designed to create pathways to equitable and inclusive solar, sustainability, and monthly savings for Georgians. Learn more at georgiabright.org. Support comes from the Grady Health Foundation, presenting Move for Grady Saturday, April 27th. When you ride, run, or walk for Grady, you help our entire community thrive. There's a distance for everyone, and all proceeds benefit Grady Health System. More at moveforgrady.com.
Well, welcome to another edition of Political Breakfast. B-Rob and I are coming off a long weekend where we celebrated learning and literacy this weekend at the Atlanta Speech School Gala. And it is true. He introduced me to the nice professional colleague of ours who definitely came up to him and said, B-Rob. But, we're really excited about this last week of the session. And B-Rob, is there anything, I know we're going to get into two topics, but is there anything that you kind of want to mention high level that you're looking for at the Capitol this week?
Yeah, there's a lot of big ticket items still hanging out there, although a lot have been put to bed already. The hospital regulations, the CON reform, that has already passed. The mini budget has passed with a lot of new spending in there for transportation and law enforcement and teachers. But we're looking now at, obviously, the sports betting legislation that will have a vote. We're taping on Monday morning. We'll have a vote this afternoon. Of course, the film tax credit and the data center tax credit is a big issue that we're looking at this week. And one thing that I want to mention there, and we can dig into those topics in a second, but something I've been doing some pro bono work on I'm very passionate about. I mentioned here on our show last year, and it's back this year because nothing happened last year. But a couple of years ago, I got involved with these guys who are exonerated for crimes they didn't commit but served more than 20 years in prison. And they have these bills in front of the General Assembly to compensate them for the lost years of their life. And granted, you can never pay that back. That has passed the House. It is strung up in the Senate right now. And we have innocent people's lives on the line here. These guys haven't been able to have jobs, haven't been able to get savings, haven't been able to be in the Social Security system. They have nothing. And Raul Bali from WABE did a very moving interview with them last week. He talked about it on Gold Dome Scramble.
I've had conversations with two men, Lee Clark and Joey Watkins, both from Northwest Georgia, both wrongfully convicted in completely separate cases. And get this, they met at Phillips State Prison in Beaufort in 2001, 23 years ago. Here's Lee talking about that.
We became good friends. We got to talking, and it turns out me and him had a lot of stuff in common. A lot of the same people that were in play, same situation with his, same attorney. I mean, I keep going on and on. So many things there. But, yeah, we developed a strong friendship.
For those of you who listen to that podcast that comes out on Fridays, really good stuff. That's something, Tharon, that I'm really looking at personally. Not a huge issue to all of Georgia, but something I'm involved in because I really care about these guys whose lives have been stolen from them.
Yeah, B-Rob, when you actually brought this to our attention, and definitely, kudos to you for doing this pro bono because it's a very, very serious matter. And when I read the article that you shared with me over the weekend, I really just kind of picked up on this and definitely read Raul's story. You're right. I mean, these are men and women all over the country, but particularly here in Georgia, that have been exonerated and that have come out, and the adjustment that they have to make, have a serving time in prison, coming back to a lifestyle where you've been, incarcerated for so long, you don't even really know the simple things like technology and also just the different things are available to you. And B-Rob, you've heard me personalize this in a different way, where I had an uncle who went to jail in the Georgia prison system for 38 years. And, he wasn't exonerated. He'd served his time and he got parole. But it's still an ongoing process for him to just go through his rehabilitation process, but get accustomed to being a citizen in society again. So I just want to commend you and this bipartisan group of legislators that have come together to look at this very important issue.
I'm glad you mentioned that it's bipartisan because you've got Scott Holcomb and Stacey Evans, Debbie Buckner on the Democrat side. You've got Katie Dempsey, Penny Houston, and others on the Republican side. Leader Abstration has been very involved in this on the House side as well. So you have Democrats and Republicans trying to do the right thing here. One thing we're trying to get accomplished there is right now there's this ridiculous process where if you're exonerated, you have to go get a legislator to sponsor legislation just for you to get paid. We're trying to create a system so that when someone is exonerated, and that doesn't mean like proven not guilty because of some technicality, it's proven innocent. It's a very high bar. Such a high bar, I'd imagine some innocent people won't be able to prove that high threshold of evidence. But if you do prove it, there should be a panel that has a system in place so that it's not haphazard, it's predictable, and it's fair. And what we have now is not predictable and it's not fair and very uneven outcomes. So that's something I would love to see get done.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in Raul's story, I mean, I think one of the proposals that I saw is that lawmakers are proposing paying, particularly the gentleman, Mr. Clark, about $1.8 million or $72,000 for every year he was wrongfully in prison. So, you know, the thing about this podcast, which we try to do with our listeners, and you and I, we've heard it from a lot of people. I mean, is that what you're hearing? Is that a lot of money, or is there a kind of pushback, or do legislators kind of want more? Like, how did they come up with that $72,000 number? Is that sort of based on sort of a metrics that is currently in place, or would this legislation sort of do it on a case-by-case basis?
It's a case-by-case basis right now. We're trying to create a system that will play out for everybody, so everyone kind of treated the same. The $72,000 a year is an arbitrary number. It's not scientific. But if you look to what other states around us are doing, it's a little bit higher than some states, a little bit lower than some other states. So it's sort of in the sweet spot, sort of in the middle of what our neighbors are doing. And speaking of our neighbors, I'll point out that we're one of only about 12 states that don't have such a process in place. So we are an outlier. We are behind the curve. This is something that needs to get fixed. It's an easy fix. This is not going to impact tens of people every year. It's going to impact a handful of people who have been wronged, and wronged in a way that we can never really repay them. And you mentioned Mr. Clark. His name's Lee Clark. He's from Rome. And when he was 17, he was put in prison because a friend of his died playing Russian roulette. It was a self-inflicted gunshot. He had nothing to do with what happened. He's now 45 years old. And in the interview with Raul, he said, I have nothing. I have nothing. I'm making minimum wage. I have no work experience. And what he wants to do, Tharon, with his $1.8 million is start a pet business in Northwest Georgia that'll like have some boarding for pets when their owners are away, maybe some doggy toys and doggy food and that kind of stuff. And so he's got aspirations, he has dreams, and he wants to be a small business owner, which is a great thing for any American to want to do.
Well, I know we want to move on to some other issues, and I think this is actually a perfect segue. You know, you and I, we're going to talk about this later in the week, but, you know, we've seen articles that have been written by reporters over at AJC about some of the toxic, sort of very, some of the toxic bills that are going through the legislature right now, where it's dividing Democrats and Republicans, and it's also, quite frankly, causing some tension in the Republican Party. But this very important issue, which is why I'm so glad we took some time to talk about it, is a huge opportunity for Democrats and Republicans to work together to pass a bipartisan measure where you have innocent people who have been proven innocent, who were in jail, some up to 30 years. You know, you've heard me talk about this before, B-Rob, but, you know, we all see those videos when these women and men are let out of prison. An attorney many times is like a Ben Crump, or it's my friends, Justin Miller and Chris Stewart and Madeline Simmons over at their law firm, where they're getting people out of jail, and they do a press conference. But then, to your point, once the press conference is over and the media coverage stops, then there's no follow-up. Like, there's no sort of place. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. Well, before we get into the legislature, Brian, I called you last week, and for our listeners, this actually does happen a lot. I was on the phone running my mouth as usual, and everyone who knows me, I'm always on the phone on a conference call or talking. I get in an Uber, and this gentleman who picked me up, his name is Anthony Bock, B-O-C-K. from Chamblee. He's originally from Iowa. And I told him I was going to give him a shout out on the podcast because he's a listener, loyal listener of the podcast, because when he's driving Uber, he listens to us. And so it was funny. Two things happened, B-Rob. One, you never know who's listening to your conversation, but he politely waited until I ended my conversation with the client. And he just says out of nowhere, "Hey, man, I love you guys on the podcast." And I called Brian and I said, "Brian, so this actually just happened." But the segue into something that I know we want to talk about in the legislature, and I do want to highlight the state of the city, is that one of the things that he said he liked most about Political Breakfast is the diversity of our topics, the ability for us to stand our ground politically on our party sort of stances, but get along in a very civil way and have that conversation. So I just wanted to shout that gentleman out because I promised him I would do it. And Anthony, thank you so much for your support.
Yes, Tharon put me on speakerphone with him so that I can speak to him too. And that does happen a lot. Radio and the podcasting is such an intimate medium that, people often don't recognize me or my face, but when they hear me talk, they're like, "Oh yeah, you're that guy. You're that guy on NPR." Right? I get that a lot. Well, going back to the General Assembly, one thing that was of great interest to me last week, and normally when something goes down in flames, we quit talking about it, but I think that this is something that is very important for the future, even though it didn't pass this year. The state Senate, which is seen as the more conservative body in the General Assembly, and as Tharon was alluding to, a bit more of a Trumpy body than the House is, they had a committee vote on Medicaid expansion, just kind of out of the blue, it seemed like. There wasn't a lot of build-up to it, but the lieutenant governor was obviously involved in this. The Rules Committee chairman, who's a very conservative senator from Noonan, voted for the Medicaid expansion, as did Carden Summers from Southwest Georgia. You kind of understand somebody from Southwest Georgia, a rural area where the Medicaid expansion issue is
America's Georgia.
From America.
To be exact, yeah. To be exact. And for our listeners, the rules chairman, can you state that senator's name?
Matt Brass, very conservative senator from Coweta County, and we're former coworkers to some degree. We both worked for Congressman Westmoreland back in the day when we were Capitol Hill staffers. And the fact that it came down to a 7-7 vote with 2 Republicans voting yes and the governor having to weigh in against it shows that there's a lot of political support there. And I think the legislature is going to have to make a decision in the offseason. Okay, so the governor's against this, but there's a pretty good base of folks here in the General Assembly, Republicans and Democrats, obviously all Democrats and enough Republicans. Is this something where you take on the governor in his final 2 years in office? Not something that we've seen very much. We've had very congenial relations between Governor Kemp and the General Assembly so far as that goes. So that would be a major change. And, that's something we see. This is nothing against Governor Kemp. But in the last couple of years of any governor's term, you begin to see that political capital begin to change a little bit as people position themselves to become governor themselves in the future. So we're beginning to see some of that play out.
Well, I'm going to take our listeners a little deeper, B-Rob, into what happened. I saw reporters like a Deidre Dukes over at Fox 5 who covers the Capitol, like a Richard Elliott over at WSB, Doug Richards, who's over at WXIA, the 11 Alive station. You saw these reporters on Thursday of last week, March 21st, and remember that date, sort of scrambling, getting to the Regulated Industries Committee. So us as lobbyists, whenever you see a sort of a herd of people kind of moving and going to a meeting, you knew something was up. What I've been told by sources, and I want to be very clear about this, I do believe that there are some Republicans that are in the legislature, House and Senate, that really want to explore a fully Medicaid expansion in Georgia. I believe there's some Republicans out there, right? And I don't want to get into naming, but clearly, as you just articulated, B-Rob, there are some other Republicans, i.e. the governor, who wants to put full Medicaid expansion on hold for now because I think they want to fully explore this pathways program that the governor has administered. And so let's walk our listeners through how this happened. What I've been told is that there was a lot of deal making in the Senate, and the state Senate right now has been very busy, particularly with the leadership. And there was an agreement. There was a deal put on the table in return for a vote for CON, which certificate of needs, which Brian has talked about, is that if Democrats would support the lieutenant governor on certificate of needs, then there in turn was going to be a hearing, a committee vote, which was in regulated industries, where the state senator David Lucas out of Macon, Georgia, had dropped a bill, and there were Republican members who had agreed to hear this bill in that committee meeting. Well, as you just pointed out, B-Rob, you had Senator Summers and Senator Brass who actually voted to move the bill forward. But then you had some other Republicans on the committee who listened. I think some of them maybe were involved in the deal that was to bring the bill out of the committee, give it a hearing, and give it a floor vote in the Senate, and hopefully move a version of full expanded Medicaid to the House. Well, what also happened is that didn't happen. As you said, the governor weighed in and was against it. I don't want to say the speaker was for or against it, because I think I would be inaccurate. I have not read that or heard that. Maybe you have, Bill Rob, but I think it was very clear the governor wanted to stop that vote. And you had these senators, these ex officio members, come in and vote. And what was very smart, B-Rob, is that I want to come on this podcast so bad and say that all Republicans are against fully expanded Medicaid in Georgia. I can't say that with good conscience because it was a tie. Yeah. And it was very strategic. So it didn't get out right. But I can say on this podcast that I know that a overwhelming majority, probably all, but at least 90+% of Democrats are totally aligned, particularly with Leader Gloria Butler, who spoke out after this hearing and made this failed committee vote and wanted a hearing and wanted to vote, are fully aligned with expanding Medicaid in the state. So again, this was almost a monumental day in Georgia, where you had Republicans and Democrats aligned to have a committee vote to basically bring up a hearing and to have a up or down vote on fully expanded Medicaid in Georgia. So the session is not over yet. Anything can happen in these next 2 legislative days. But just wanted to take our listeners into what I was told and what has been said publicly about how this happened, how it almost happened, and why it didn't happen. And let's see if it may come back up before the session ends on Thursday at midnight.
Thank you for that, Tharon. You know, what I think what's going on here was Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones really wanted to see hospital regulation reform. He has desire to see a hospital built in his own rural county and push this legislation. And he wanted it to be bipartisan. He wanted to be able to get Democrats on board. I think allowing this vote on Medicaid expansion and kind of letting loose Republicans to vote for it if they wanted to, that was part of the deal between Leader Butler and Lieutenant Governor Jones. I don't have that written down or confirmed, but it would seem to make sense that this was part of a deal to get this moving. And I thought what it showed was a latent bit of support for it. If it was put on the floor of both houses, it would pass. If the support is there, it's just got to get through the process. And right now there's, Ossoff and Warnock put in $1.2 billion in the COVID relief package a few years back for Georgia to get extra money when it expands. And it will eventually. It's going to happen eventually because the American system now depends on this. And this is kind of how it works. So it's still an issue that's a big one for Georgia and one that's going to take up, I think, a lot of oxygen next year.
As we close this out, look, I'm optimistic. You're right, B. Rob. Listen, I think if it were to be voted on before Thursday at midnight, it would pass. And and the lieutenant governor definitely struck that deal with Leader Butler. And let's, for our listeners, I know we got a lot of lobbyists and legislators and staff of legislators that listen to this podcast. The CON bill did get Democratic support, enough Democratic support where it could actually move on. So the Democrats didn't really get all of what they wanted out of the deal, but they at least got a chance to try to move this measure forward.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
The field of mental health counseling is growing rapidly, and Richmont Graduate University can equip you with everything you need as a licensed professional counselor while integrating your faith into your clinical practice. Programs are offered in Atlanta, Chattanooga, and online. Apply today at richmont.edu. That's RICHMONT.edu.
Well, the next thing I want to talk about, B. Rob, and you've been really nice to my guy, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, and I think you may have a couple things kind of pending at the city of Atlanta where you've been fair to him, and I know we've had him on the show, but I just wanted to take the last few minutes to just commend the mayor for an outstanding State of the City address, which he had Monday morning in Atlanta. And what was unique about this was not just the scene, which was unique. It was at the Woodruff Art Center in Midtown Atlanta, a packed house in an auditorium style where the mayor came out and had a diverse group of people who delivered the prayer, had a monologue with these two gentlemen talking about all the growth in the city and things that the mayor is talking, tremendous support from the Atlanta Committee for Progress. The business community was there. And the thing that the mayor was very, I think, defiant about was reemphasizing the things that he's been able to do while he's been in office. And he was definitely very bold about it. He talked about sort of breaking news. And, this, B. Rob, is that the state of the city, just much like the state of the state or the state of the union, is where you want to break news. But there were a couple things that he continued to mention. He talked about public safety, how homicides are down, how major crime is down in the city. He wants people to feel safe. He also talked about how he's willing to expand transit in the area around the city of Atlanta by announcing new 4 MARTA stations that the city is going to be working with MARTA, one in particular near the BeltLine. We'll be clear, not on the BeltLine, but near the BeltLine. And then the third thing, he just really quadrupled down on the success of his Year to Youth, which, last year he declared it's a Year to Youth. And he talked about homelessness. We all talked about it on this podcast where he's come up with innovative ways to deal with this crisis. And you've heard me talk about this, B. Rob, as much attention as we put on immigration reform and protecting the border, healthcare, homelessness has got to be at the top of the list as well. So, he's come up with this Melody neighborhood that is using these containers to have temporary housing from homelessness. And then lastly, I was very happy to hear the mayor talking about his successful working relationship with the state. He commended the governor publicly, commended the legislature publicly for working with them on measures that are very important to the city's growth. And he also talked a lot about his new role as being the chair of the Atlanta Regional Commission, how he wants to work with other mayors and other counties to make sure that their cities are thriving. And he lastly talked a lot about the businesses that have been created, particularly female-owned businesses, minority entrepreneur participation in the city. So it was just a good energy, good crowd, diverse crowd in Midtown. It was early. The food was good. And just shout out to Hala and the Woodruff Art Center and Coca-Cola, who was also the major sponsor for this wonderful event that happened on Monday.
Yeah, I tell you what, the mayor is kind of cruising toward re-election. That's coming up next year. No one's really seriously talking about taking him on. I think he's got a lot of strong support in the city. And there's some things that I've been very supportive of and appreciate about his term in office. One, he has not sounded like so many progressive mayors in America when it comes to crime. He's not out there making excuses for crime. And when you talk about stuff like homelessness, yes, there's one element about being compassionate toward those who have to live like that. The hard aspects of that life is tragic, but it's also bad for the city to have homeless encampments all over the place. It is a public hygiene problem. It is a public nuisance. It is a crime problem. It's bad for business. It's not great for neighborhoods, right? So it's just bad all the way around. And so it's a quality of life issue in addition to being a public welfare issue for those who are suffering from homelessness. So I appreciate what he's done on that. I appreciate what he's done on the Public Safety Training Center. We are seeing crime get under control in Atlanta. The numbers are better than they've been in past years. That's going to be a really strong message going into 2025 for him because when he got elected, that was at the forefront of people's minds. We were very close in history to the time of those riots coming out of the George Floyd time in 2020. And I think the city is just in a much better place right now. And that's not solely because of the mayor. There's a lot of leadership from a lot of organizations and a lot of national trends happening that sort of take us in the right place. But he's been at the forefront of these things. He's been out talking about them. He has been present and seen in the community, which was a criticism I had of his predecessor, someone we didn't see out in the community the way that we see him out in the community, and he seems to love the job. And I also want to commend him. You mentioned his shout out to the governor and the legislature. he has shown that going and having those relationships with the Republicans in the General Assembly and in the governor's office, it's not just smart, it's good politics. You're able to get stuff done that plays well with your own constituency. And for someone like him, who's got some innate political ability and talent, be able to say that you can work with Republicans and get things done in a state that's as purplish as we are now, where people in the middle want pragmatic leadership, I think it gives him a really strong argument for whatever he wants to do in the future.
The other thing that and I know we're going to wrap this up, I just want to take our listeners into the scene. It was also a huge shout out to his cabinet for working diligently on some very important issues. And you saw council members there. I mean, good group of council members who support this mayor. But he also, B-Rob and Lily, announced that the Public Safety Training Center will be completed by the end of the year, and it's ahead of schedule. I think that was another thing that he was pretty boastful about in the State of the City address. And another thing that I think that, as you mentioned about the mayor and re-election mode, he's got to continue to stay focused on the basics. And when I spoke with him about a week ago, he's very, very focused on the basics. Of course, they talked about potholes being filled. But also, I just want to give a shout out, and I think about this a lot, B-Rob. Every morning, there are men and women who go out and provide city services in the city of Atlanta and Brookhaven, Sandy Springs, you name it. And particularly people who, do the hard work like picking up trash, who have to go around and pick up debris. The mayor talked a lot about cleaning the city up with debris. But I just want to say a special thank you to those essential workers, these frontline workers in all of our cities and counties across the state that do those hard jobs. And I just want to thank you all personally, because if it is not for those people that do those jobs every day to make our lives easier, we would be in a total different situation. So I just really felt like the mayor highlighted his essential workers. He talked about this new program, B-Rob, that I think is very important. I think you agree about. It's called Atlanta Cares, and it's going to be a group of women and men who will go out to respond to non-emergency, life-threatening 911 and 311 calls. He says specifically, not every call in the city of Atlanta deserves a sworn officer to come. We want those officers and those firefighters and people focusing on those important crimes. And every crime or every incident is very important. But I think this new Atlanta Care Unit is going to be something that I think the public is going to respond pretty positively to.
That's great. Police officers are not trained mental health counselors. We shouldn't expect them to be. And that is unfortunately how our process has begun to work. Our jails are now basically housing the mentally ill, and that is not the way this is supposed to work.
Well, man, this is the first time I think ever. Usually you kind of run the show here, and I think Lily is going to be proud of us. We're going to stay within our time constraints, but
yes.
Definitely want to thank everyone for listening. We miss Lisa. She'll be back with us soon, and just really wish everyone a safe and happy Easter weekend, and look forward to spending time with my family.
Hey y'all, I'm Mark Kendall.
And I'm David Perdue.
And we're the hosts of What's Good Atlanta, the new weekly comedy podcast from WABE.
On What's Good Atlanta, we run down uplifting and unusual headlines from the universe known as Atlanta.
And while we may not be journalists, we are comedians, and we'll be breaking down news and breaking down the stories that make you smile.
We're just trying to see what's good, Atlanta.
Episodes drop Fridays at WABE.org or wherever you get your podcasts. I get mine from a guy named Craig.
Shout out to Craig.
Mm-hmm.
WABE. The world has changed, from shifts in power to a mental health crisis. So with all this social change, how do we balance the human desire for empathy, the business need for productivity, and the hope to make an impact in our community? This is a new podcast, The Social Impact Leader. I'm Jeff Shinabarker. Join me as we explore people doing work a little different. Available every Wednesday at wabe.org/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts.
WABE.